In this lesson, we're going to look at how evolution works. So as a review, remember that mutations provide that variation. The variation is then acted on by natural selection, and this results in some individuals being more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass along those beneficial adaptations. So first, let's look at what species are. And species are a genetically different population. All right, different species generally can't or won't interbreed with each other. So for example, bonobos and chimpanzees look very similar, act very similar, but they are different enough that they won't interbreed in the wild and therefore are different species. Alright, now let's look at kind of what makes up ecosystems. Alright, so this should be a review from Earth Science, but remember that there are the non-living things, the abiotic factors, and then the biotic factors, or the living things, and those are the two parts that make up an ecosystem. Alright, and then remember, let's look at how species interact within this. And again, this should be a review, but how you interact with your ecosystem is called your niche. In other words, how do you fit into the food web? What are the symbiotic relationships that you have with other species in your ecosystem? What is your role within the ecosystem? All of that is your niche. And all of this results in what we call selective pressures. Alright, and so a selective pressure is simply something that makes it harder for an organism to survive. Think things like competition, natural selection. And this is going to determine how adapted an organism is. So the better an individual is at dealing with these selective pressures, the more adapted it is, and therefore the more likely it is to survive and reproduce and pass along those beneficial adaptations. So now let's look at how abiotic factors actually select organisms, how they become selective pressures. So an organism has to be adapted to the conditions of its ecosystem. Things like temperature, water availability, and topography, which is the lay of the land. So for example, a cheetah is very well adapted to the environment of the savanna, which is wide and open, but it would be very poorly adapted to this particular mountainous ecosystem. And so temperature, water, and topography are selective pressures. They are things that make it harder for organisms to survive and things that organisms have to be adapted to. So now let's look at how biotic factors select. Predation is one of the most important ones. Alright, and it includes getting food. So for example, this tiger has a number of different adaptations for getting food. It's camouflaged, it has very special claws and teeth, it has the ability to ambush its prey, so there's a lot of adaptations this organism has to getting food. Similarly, this giraffe has an incredibly long neck for getting food. The anglerfish has its lure. And kudzu has the ability to climb up and overtop all kinds of things to get to the light, which is what it uses to make food. So these are all adaptations to getting food. On the flip side, many organisms have adaptations towards not becoming food for others. So again, camouflage with this fawn, spines on the cactus, speed and agility with these deer. This sunfish has very razor sharp spines, and it's very tall, so it's very hard for an organism, another fish, to actually eat it. And this moth has eye spots that make the birds think that it's a large organism that might eat them or something like that, and scares them away. Additionally, we have symbiotic relationships. So this remora fish has an adaptation towards sticking to the bottom of things like sharks to hitch a ride. So how you interact with other species symbiotically can also cause you to have adaptive traits. And then finally, diseases. Diseases are a major selective force because some individuals are going to be more susceptible, some individuals are going to be more able to survive. And that is going to select for the resistance to those diseases. So for example, malaria has had a major selective force on human beings. Now, evolution only really happens when ecosystems change. And when this happens, some species are not going to be able to adapt and they're going to go extinct. Think woolly mammoths after the end of the Ice Age. Some species are going to have to change. So for example, this chimpanzee is very well adapted to a jungle, but if the conditions change such that the jungle becomes more of a savanna, being able to swing around in trees is not very helpful. And it's going to result in a change in that species towards modes of transportation like walking, things that are more well adapted towards the open plains. And then some species are going to come out of nowhere, or they're adapting enough and changing enough that we'll get new species. So some go away and some come about. So speciation is the formation of a new species. And we're going to go look at how this works with environmental changes and a process called geographic isolation. And geographic isolation is going to work like this. Here we have one species of tree. Now the populations have been physically separated by this river. They have been isolated by a geographic thing. All right, that's where the geographic isolation comes from. Now, because mutations are random, different mutations are going to happen in the two different populations, and there's not going to be the ability for these mutations to cross over. So we're going to have a buildup of different mutations to the point that eventually there's going to be so many mutations and they're going to be so different that we're going to end up with two species of trees. So this is just one way that speciation occurs, but this happens a lot.